Make no mistake about that. Americans are the largest consumers of illegal drugs in the world. According to the CIA, Americans are the largest consumers of cocaine from Colombia, much of it brought up through Mexico. Poor Mexico. What they're going through is a horror because of illegal drugs. Heroin from Colombia, brought up through Mexico. Marijuana, ecstasy, methamphetamine from Mexico. This is where Americans are getting their drugs, and they will have their drugs. Let's look at the costs. Each year, the federal government spends about $20 billion on drug law enforcement. This doesn't include what each of the states spends. Jeffrey Miron, a professor of economics at Harvard, prepared a report in 2005 about marijuana. He estimated that federal and state governments spend roughly $41 billion a year enforcing the war on drugs. Professor Miron's report also estimates that drug legalization would yield tax revenues of $46.7 billion annually. That's year after year after year. Assuming legal drugs were taxed at the rates comparable to those on alcohol and tobacco. Add in enforcement savings, you have a total yield of $88 billion a year. And what the federal government spends on treatment and prevention is chump change, $7 billion. And I have to point out that although the current administration has shifted anti-drug rhetoric away from the war on drugs metaphor and started talking about drug abuse as a public health problem, this change in rhetoric has not been accompanied by any change in policy. As I'm sure many of you know, the states that have enacted medical marijuana laws, such as California and Washington, are finding themselves in trouble for violating federal drug laws. So despite the incredible increase in costs, federal spending has increased by more than 1,800%. I didn't know it was possible to have that higher percentage. 1,800%. The war on drugs has failed. No matter how much money we throw at it, the war on drugs will never work. Other countries have decided they're no longer willing to fight this war on drugs. In the late 90s, drug abuse was a significant, uncontrollable social problem in Portugal. They studied it. They determined that the best strategy was to decriminalize drugs. So Portugal passed a law decriminalizing drugs. The drugs are decriminalized. They're not legal, but violations are considered administrative rather than criminal. Instead of being sent to court and prison, users are sent to counseling when necessary treatment, and guess what? No criminal record. And I want to remind you, despite loud warnings to the contrary from the people we hear all the time, the drug war hawks, usage rates in Portugal dropped substantially for every substance among the critical age group, 13 to 18-year-olds. They've had health benefits. From 2001 to 2008, the number of people being treated for their addiction went up by 20%. Portugal says there was no increase in spending because the funds were diverted from the criminal justice system. They're happy. Switzerland gives us another example. They faced an intense problem of drug abuse, particularly heroin abuse, in the late 80s and early 90s. They had increasing numbers of HIV/AIDS cases as a result of illicit drug use. They developed a new drug policy. They began to look at drug addiction as a disorder or illness. They developed an experiment to treat heroin addicts with government-manufactured heroin. Government manufactured. Takes it out of the illegal realm. In addition, they authorize methadone programs, safe injection rooms, needle exchange programs across the country, including prisons. And let me add here, in this country, we have the most secure prison system in the world. People don't escape. Well, you know what? Every one of them has a drug problem. Every one. We can keep people in, we can't keep drugs out. Switzerland's program resulted in an average drop of 80% in felonies committed by patients who'd been in the program for at least a year. Rates of HIV and hepatitis among drug users have plummeted. They found a serious reduction in the consumption of illicit heroin and illicit cocaine. This public health approach also saves Switzerland money. Criminal justice costs have been reduced because of the reduced rates of crime. If it's not a crime to use drugs, the rate of crime goes down, and you don't have to waste money on law enforcement with something that's not a crime anymore. So, despite catastrophic warnings that helping addicts instead of prosecuting them sends the wrong message, the Swiss program has led to fewer new heroin users. Fewer. They're happy. The reasons for the program's success aren't clear. Many experts feel this is because the program makes heroin seem unattractive to young people. Duh. And there's less of a social opportunity to be introduced to heroin. We have to accept the fact that some people will always be addicted to something. Some people are more vulnerable than others when it comes to addictions. Some people become addicted to certain activities, gambling or alcohol, for example, that most of us can engage in without becoming dependent, addicted. We have to try to minimize that number of people who are vulnerable and help people who truly need help. Keep in mind, when drugs were made illegal in 1914, the government justified it by stating that 1.3% of the population was addicted to drugs. And remember, in 1971, the war on drugs was begun because at that time, it was estimated that addicted to drugs. After about 90 years of illegality, including over 40 years of a war against drugs. What was that number? 1.3%. No change. No change, no reduction. I'm almost done. Let me be clear. We don't advocate or promote any type of drug use. But we also don't advocate wasteful, harmful, and misguided policies that don't work. It's time for a new approach. We want to see drugs legalized, regulated, and taxed. In closing, I want to thank you for being here and for giving me the opportunity to speak to you about this problem. I hope you'll agree with me that drug addiction is a public health matter and not a matter for criminal justice. If you want to support the work we do at L.E.A.P, I invite you to join our coalition of over 40,000 people who want to help us replace the war on drugs with some smart policies. You can go online, look up Cops Say Legalize Drugs, or just type in L.E.A.P. We've got to end this failed policy and try a better, smarter approach, and it's time to legalize marijuana now. Thank
you. Give Joanne Norton some love, making the argument for a better world.